most of the countries in Europe were actually preventing asylum seekers and refugees to join the labor market, and this changed radically since the arrival of more than 1 million refugees last year.
It's a great pleasure to have Ivàn Martin with us. He was until very recently part-time professor at the European University Institute in Florence. Ivàn Martin was linked also to work at our institute in the context of a study which he just completed, or it's being published just now, from refugees to workers, on labor market integration of refugees and the type of policy experiences in a number of countries. So, Ivàn, thank you for coming, and let us start with describing a little bit the outline of this study and what was the purpose, what were the results which you mostly obtained in the study.
Yeah, the main objective of the study on what we call REFMISMES, labor market integration support measures for refugees and asylum seekers, was to look in detail support measures implemented by European states, countries, in order to facilitate the labor market integration of newly arrived refugees. And basically what we did is to try to do an inventory of these different kind of measures along 5 different categories of measures having to do with job intermediation, skills upgrade, skills recognition, integrated packages and other categories, in order to find some elements of assessment of to which extent they were being effective in facilitating the labor market integration.
In fact, you started this project just when the peak of the refugee developments in the last year were quite acute in a sense, and there was a lot of discussion of it. So in a sense, it was early in really tracking the experience of countries with that new refugee wave. And I guess most of the institutional, legal, labor market policy frameworks were basically installed in relation to earlier refugee
Absolutely.
situations.
This is a key issue there, because most of the countries in Europe were actually preventing asylum seekers and refugees to join the labor market, and this changed radically since the arrival of more than 1 million refugees last year. The way the study originated was actually that the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany approached us. They were conducting a very limited study in Germany only, and they approached us suggesting that we would analyze or conduct a study with leading to policy-oriented recommendations. And we said, well, this is very clearly an European issue we have to deal with, so it is maybe interesting to take a comparative European approach, so to put together a team of country experts, including of course your institute, in order to apply a common methodology to try to analyze the effectiveness of labor market integration support measures.
Which countries did you include, and did you find a lot of heterogeneity in the policy frameworks which you analyzed?
Yes, we expected a lot of heterogeneity. The countries we analyzed were basically Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, France and Italy. Those 9, and the Netherlands, those 9 countries. And we expected, because the structure of the labor market is very different across countries, the kind of programs to assist and help the refugees are very different. The legal context is also different. We also include the UK, the United Kingdom. But actually what we found is first and foremost that the kind of challenges related to labor market integration are pretty much similar across countries. And not only that, the policy response is being quite similar as well in terms of the concrete measures that are being implemented. We even identified the kind of a standard package that all countries seem to use in order to address labor market integration of refugees.
Can you tell us a little bit about the main components of this package and in which way there might be best practices in one country learning from other countries in these different components?
Yeah, the 4 big components were language courses, early competence check or skills assessment, job intermediation services, and trying to put all these different elements together in an integrated package with other social benefits and support measures. In terms of best practices, this was more difficult. Of course, this was one of the things the Bertelsmann Stiftung was most interested in. First, because it is a policy in the making. Only during the 6 months of field work we were conducting, 4 of the 9 countries changed the laws regarding labor market integration of refugees. So it was very difficult to gather any objective evidence to draw conclusions on which policies work better. However, what we found is that precisely because this common structure of the policy response in different countries, there is a lot of scope for cross-country learning and for sharing practices and results. In terms of what seems to work better, since they are very recent policies, we basically interrogated the actors and the stakeholders for their opinions on the effectiveness, because there is no solid evidence to conduct any objective scientific analysis. And what we found is that most people don't think there is anything that works very clearly. There are a lot of obstacles, this is very clear, but there is no consensus so far on what works better. Even the country which has advanced most in these kind of programs, which is Sweden, they have very contradicting evidence and they have changed policy several times, precisely because they don't exactly know what works better. However, despite this, I would say, pessimistic view of the effectiveness of those measures, the major change taking place in the last year in Europe is that states are mobilizing increasing resources, and also not only budget resources but also institutional resources in order to address this issue. And we see how public employment services and other training institutions in many countries are really trying to adapt themselves to the needs, specific needs of these new customers, the refugees and asylum seekers. And of course, what remains to be seen is to which extent this effort, which now is being deployed and was not the case before, is effective or not.
In fact, countries probably had very different experiences because the wave of refugees in the past might have been very different ones from the ones experienced now. Like in Austria, it used to be the major wave was with the Yugoslav crisis early on, and now, of course, it comes more from the Middle East. Is the nature of these refugee flows, does it create very different challenges for labor market integration?
It definitely creates different outcomes. We have identified in several countries of the study, I'm thinking now of the Netherlands, for instance, very different labor market integration outcomes across different nationalities and profiles of refugees. In terms of response to the ongoing, actually, because it is still ongoing, refugee flow, I think that it was of a magnitude that didn't allow the authorities and the states to develop tailor-made responses to different groups of refugees. So this is why actually what we have seen is that most of the countries have somehow reacted in the same way. The next challenge and the next step would be precisely to differentiate this response according to the different needs of different groups of refugees.
In fact, the research or the past experience shows quite a distinct difference between refugees and migrants, traditional migrants who are coming mostly for work or later on with family reunion, in terms of the labor market integration being much more difficult with refugees. A rule of thumb which seems to have developed was that over a 5-year period, about 50% of those who were granted asylum get into employment. Why do you see that there is so much more difficulty to place refugees in the labor market?
Well, I think actually this is well established that refugees take much longer to integrate into the labor market on average than even the rest of migrants, with the exception of family reunification beneficiaries. If you look at the labor market integration pattern, it is very similar for family reunification beneficiaries and for refugees. And it is only for international students and migrants coming for employment purposes that it is much better. In my opinion, there are two major reasons for that. One is the fact that refugees and family reunification beneficiaries, when they arrive to Europe, they are not workers. They have gone through an experience that has taken away their activity, professional activity potential, and you have to reactivate them, and this takes time. For different reasons. In the case of family reunification beneficiaries, mainly because 2/3 of them are women who have never worked before, so they are not active. In the case of, and they may get active when they go to Europe, but after some adaptation. In the case of refugees, because they have gone through traumatic experiences, they come from, they don't speak the language, they don't know the culture, and they have to adapt before they can integrate into the labor market or take a job. There is another important reason, though, which we shouldn't forget, is that the structure of incentives is very different. For the case of labor migrants, they come to work. So it would be surprising that they don't integrate into the labor market. They wouldn't come in the first place. In the case of refugees, they flee from one persecution or conflict, and as such, they are entitled to certain social benefits. And so far, because in most countries the labor market integration of refugees was not a priority, rather it was something to be avoided for different policy reasons, the social benefits they receive are not adapted to integrate smoothly into the labor market integration of refugees. So we have spotted in several countries, in France, in even in Austria, for instance, I mean, asylum seekers can work after, I think, 3 months. If they ask for a special permission, only in 3 different temporary seasonal work activities. But even if they work, the only money that they can get of their salary is 110 euros. This may sound a month. Yeah. This may sound legitimate because they are benefiting from social benefits, but this is not encouraging them a lot to take a job, because at the end for them it is working for 110 euros.
So there's a danger in this early period when asylum process, which can be quite lengthy, is going on, that they lose contact to work, and also their work experience declines, their skills are not attuned to the labor market. So I guess one of the important results, which most analysts would say, is one should try as quickly as possible to get them interested in the labor market, give them incentives to do so. However, the reforms seem to go in the other direction, isn't it? There's a lot of fear of the impact of a large wave of refugees disturbing the local labor markets. So how do you see this tension developing, and is there a way how politically or through policy this tension can be somehow modified?
Well, first, there is a wide consensus across stakeholders, actors, experts, that the sooner asylum seeker can integrate into the labor market, the smoother this integration process will be. So there is a clear case for facilitating this integration from moment one when they arrive. There is also very clearly a position, rather political position, I would say, stating that allowing them to integrate into the labor market undermines the employment or wage prospects of local population, where all over Europe there are substantial rates of unemployment. However, this is, in my opinion, more based in a political stance than a technical or economic stance. Actually, most of European unemployment has to do with mismatches between skills and mismatches between expectations. And it is not taken for granted that the arrival of new workers into the labor market, who are most of them low skilled with language problems, so they tend to integrate into the lower parts of the labor market, will actually take away those jobs from local workers, but rather actually make it possible that those local workers upgrade their skills and work in more productive and more paying jobs. Of course, there, for the smooth labor market integration of refugees, as for the fighting unemployment in our societies, a strong education and skills development policies required, both for local unemployed and for refugees and asylum seekers.
Let me ask you on another area which is very often argued, which says that refugees should be really not encouraged to get too much integrated inside, because their societies need them when the crisis, the conflict dissipates. Very recently we had Paul Collier from Oxford University over here, who gave a talk very much in those lines, that it is, especially in conflict zones, the danger of a brain drain of the skilled personnel is very high. So basically, refugee policy structure should be designed to be temporary. What is your view on that issue?
Well, this goes clearly against evidence we have. Worldwide, the average period of stay of refugees, of the 20-something million refugees worldwide, is 17 years. So after 17 years, any prospect of reintegrating into the society of origin is certainly not a matter of skills, it has to do with other issues. In Austria, for instance, the average period of stay of refugees who have arrived in the last 25 years is 16 years. So, and in many of those conflicts, certainly in Syria, there is no way to think that most of those refugees are going to find a country, if they would like to go back, which will welcome them with work or with any professional prospects. So I think that theoretically, of course, it makes sense. Let's keep these skills on hold, on reserve, for contributing to the development of the areas of origin when the conflicts are settled. The best way to do that, even in my opinion, is to make sure that they have a good professional life and they don't lose for 5, 10 or 17 years the contact with the world of labor. And on the other hand, I think it is illusory to think that all of those migrants are going to go back.
But they could still be...
it hasn't happened in the past.
But there could still be business connections, trade connections.
But this will happen spontaneously.
It will come
and actually this will happen much more easily if refugees are well integrated into host societies.
Now let me ask you a big question about the future in a way. Some people would argue that the refugee waves which we have seen last year and which continues this year is only an indication of a very continuous flow of potential refugees mixed with economic motives to come, basically because we are surrounded in the European Union by pretty economically and politically unstable countries and regions. And of course, there are also other reasons like technology, information is spreading much more quickly. So these are long-term challenges, and how do you see the adjustment process in policy terms, in adjustment of labor markets in the European Union, and the probably feedback on this rather unstable region around Europe evolving?
Well, first, I certainly share this view of that this is only the beginning. For me, this is very clear. Any evidence or indication we have from Africa, for instance, points to a steady increase of migration flows. It hasn't begun, actually. And what we have, I always say, Europe has has felt completely threatened because the arrival of 1.5, not even million Syrians. This is less than 1/3 of the population increase of 1 year of one African country, which is Nigeria, who is adding 5 additional million Africans every year. And this is going to be so until 2050. So the migration potential is huge. I don't agree, however, that the main reason is because it's instability. I think that there are two major drivers behind migration potential. Is inequality, not instability as such. Inequality
within the countries of origin,
across countries,
between countries. Okay, the big gap in incomes.
Absolutely, and wages.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
And secondly, demography. All regions in the world historically have produced a lot of migration, including Europe, when they have gone through the demographic transition. Europe has sent 100 million people to Americas.
Yes.
And this is what we are seeing in Africa now, only accelerated.
But the Americas were seen as empty spaces, probably wrongly, but
that's the issue. This is why now it is much more conflictual.
Yes.
But the migration pressure is there, as it was there in Europe as well at the time. So, and probably because of that, the impact of that migration was much more positive in the development of Europe. So I think this demography and inequality, which are the key drivers. On demography, we cannot do anything more because the transition is being completed. On inequalities, we can do something, and this would be the main long-term policy analysis. The issue, though, is that clearly this has come in a moment where Europe is aging, and is retreating in terms of social perceptions. And there is a major fear of all aliens coming to Europe. Some of them legitimate, of course, but basically having to do with social psychology much more than with economics.
Yes.
And this, I'm not a social psychologist, so I cannot say how to address these issues. In any case, for me, it is very clear that we have to get used to the idea of integrating increasing numbers of aliens, immigrants from Africa, from the Middle East in the coming decades. For me, this is very clear. There is no other way we can imagine a future.
So this really needs much more political science or almost anthropological approach to study what will happen if societies react very negatively towards this big challenge, which is reflecting a complementarity both in population dynamics, but of course also the type of what economists would call convergence processes, which are going on across the Mediterranean. And I think the other element, the third element which you might have mentioned, is the degree of political instability, which leads to eruptions and to waves of refugee flows, which could, of course, also be another angle by which policy could intervene.
For sure,
no?
For sure. This is very clear.
So I think you have persuaded us that this is a topic which will stay with us for a long time. It's one of the big policy issues which European policymakers and not only economists are facing in the future. Thank you very much for your
insights. Thank you. I'm sure of that. Thank you.